Hello, Modern Europe, and welcome to our penultimate lecture podcast. That's right, there is only one more after this. We're almost to the end of the course. In this lecture, we're going to be looking at the 1930s, also known as the tortured decade. Why? Because things were pretty awful in the 1930s. Where do we begin? There was a worldwide economic depression that put millions of people out of work, plenty of poverty and suffering. And the Nazis and Hitler came to power in Germany and began a decade and a half of incredible oppression against Jewish people. Then there was the Stalinist revolution, where Stalin killed millions of his own people in the Soviet Union. So, lots and lots of awful stuff. Nevertheless, important history, so let's jump right in. The learning objectives for this unit are: number 1, outline the Great Depression, including factors which created it, and how governments reacted to it. Describe the Stalinist revolution in the USSR. And finally, articulate the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party in Germany. The Great Depression, which began in 1929 and lasted more than a decade, was unprecedented, both before and since. There has never been an economic depression of this magnitude in Western history. Although it originated in the United States, its effects were felt all around the world. The social and cultural effects were no less staggering. Coming out of the Great Depression, the world was, quite frankly, a very different place. So how did it happen? So let's start by talking about what it was. The Great Depression was a severe economic crisis which lasted more than a decade. As I said, it originated in the USA, but it spread worldwide. This is an indication of just how intertwined the world economy had become by the time we get to the 1930s. A severe shock in one part of the system could have an effect in every other part. Normally, the stock market crash of 1929 is the way that people would say the beginning of the Great Depression. But really, the stock market crash was a symptom of the Great Depression. It had already begun. The reasons for the Great Depression are complex and varied and still debated by economists and historians today, but I'll try to explain to you some of the main theories about why it took place. Needless to say, the Great Depression caused massive suffering worldwide. It was even felt here in Canada. Here you see an image of unemployed men in Toronto during the Great Depression, and one of the images I just showed you earlier was unemployed men in Winnipeg. In 1933, at the height of the Great Depression, there was a 20% unemployment rate in Canada. To put this into perspective, even in the last several recessions, we've never come close to that type of employment rate. At the height of the COVID pandemic, at the beginning of May 2020, we reached an unprecedented level of 13% unemployment, but that had fallen to just 9% by September of 2020. It's hard to imagine what 20% unemployment would feel like. The result was the Great Depression. So why did the Great Depression happen? Well, there is no single one answer, and I will say that the debate amongst economists and historians continues to this day about all the different complexities that led to the Great Depression. However, we can point to 4 factors which almost certainly worked together to cause the Depression. The first factor was war debt. This is debt coming out of the First World War, and many Western countries were heavily indebted, particularly European countries, but also the United States as well. Also, in the late 1920s, there was quite a bit of stock market speculation. Credit was relatively easy to come by. That means it was relatively easy to borrow money, and interest rates were relatively low. This encouraged more risky borrowing than otherwise might have happened. We'll also talk about a concept called overproduction and underconsumption. This was a phenomena of the late Second Industrial Revolution, where products were outpacing customers to actually buy them. And finally, falling grain prices in the late 1920s also contributed to the Great Depression. So I'm going to discuss each of these factors in a little bit more detail. So I want to talk a little bit about how the cycle of war debt contributed to the Great Depression. So during the First World War, countries were racking up tons and tons of debt to pay for their war effort. Remember, countries were participating in total war. That is, that they were mobilizing their entire economy, their entire citizenry, their entire industrial base in order to support the war effort. And that is really expensive. Britain and France in particular had relied on borrowing money from the United States in order to support their war effort. Germany had also found itself hugely in debt. Unfortunately for Germany, it lost the war. And if you recall, the Treaty of Versailles was not particularly kind to the Germans. Britain and France insisted on huge reparation payments that the Germans would be forced to make to Britain and France to bear their cost for the responsibility for the war. Now, the thing is that Germany really didn't have the money to pay those reparation payments. And so this was going to be a problem. The stability of Germany in the 1920s was something that was of concern. Nobody wanted to see the country descend into another war again. Yet during the 1920s, we saw Germany going through periods of hyperinflation. Their economy was basically in shambles. Part of this was to do with paying those huge reparation payments to Britain and France. And Britain and France, of course, needed those reparation payments in order to make their debt payments to the United States. In comes the United States to try to figure out a solution to this problem. A so-called Dawes Plan, named after the Vice President of the United States, saw the United States loan money to Germany so that Germany could stabilize its economy and pay its reparation payments to Britain and France, so that Britain and France could in turn pay back their debt to the United States. You can see that this is really a very strange cycle of debt, money moving around in a circle. Needless to say, it wouldn't take much for this whole house of cards to come crashing down. Another contributing factor to the Great Depression was speculation. So what is speculation? Well, speculation is simply investing, but it's different from regular investing in a few important factors. Normally, when an investor invests in a company, it's because that investor believes that the company is sound, that the company will increase in value over time, and that they're making a smart investment because the products of the company that they sell are going to be continuing to be in demand, etc., etc. A speculator isn't as concerned about the actual bricks and mortar aspect of a business. They are concerned about one thing and one thing only. Is the stock going to go up? And if the stock is going to go up, then who cares whether the company is sound? Who cares whether the company is solvent? We can still make money off of it. So speculators are looking to make quick money out of the stock market by buying stocks at one price and then selling it hopefully a little bit later on at a higher price and making a profit. Now this works, of course, as long as the stock market is going up. And there have always been speculators, and there always will be speculators. And normally speculation is not going to cause a contraction in the system. What happened during the 1920s is that the speculation was based partially on debt. And this is where it started to cause problems. So often speculators, when they wanted to invest in the stock market, didn't necessarily have all the money themselves to be able to buy the stock. However, stock brokers and stock market firms, often in a goal to sell as much stock as possible, would often allow them to simply pay 10% of the price of the stock, and then they would lend them the 90% that was remaining. Now again, there's no problem with this as long as the stock price goes up, because at the end of the day, the stock will be more valuable, the investor will be able to make money, and the firms that sold the stock will be able to have their debt repaid. So it's all good as long as the stock market is going up. Frequently, speculators didn't even have to pay the 10% themselves. Instead, they would turn to banks, and banks would lend them the 10%. So you would have people who are investing in the stock market with actually none of their own money. It would all be borrowed money. Now, you can imagine that this can be dangerous, because if the stock market goes down for whatever reason, we're going to have problems. The banks themselves were also involved in speculation and were constantly reinvesting whatever capital they had into the stock market. Well, in the late 1920s, it does come crashing down. And when it does, this whole house of cards, which is supported by debt, which has very little real capital at its base, is going to cause a massive contraction, which it does when the stock market crashed in September of 1929. The third factor contributing to the Great Depression is overproduction and underconsumption. By the time we get to the late 1920s, we're at the height of the Second Industrial Revolution. Production techniques, assembly line techniques, had become so sophisticated that products had become cheaper and cheaper to produce. However, wages at the same time had not kept pace. By the end of the 1920s, there were basically too many consumer goods being unsold in the United States. Essentially, everyone who could afford to buy a radio or afford to buy a car had already purchased one. Mass production methods had essentially led to supply outstripping demand. What companies then did next often exacerbated the problem and made it worse. As people weren't buying their products, companies laid off workers. With workers laid off, there were even less people available to buy consumer products. So all of this reached a head right before the Great Depression in the late 1920s. So the fourth contributing factor to the Great Depression were falling grain prices during the 1920s. During the First World War, U.S. farmers had been encouraged to try to grow more food to support the war effort, and prices during the war years for grain were steadily rising. This in turn encouraged more and more people to get into the farming business. More land was purchased and put under the plow. Farming equipment was purchased, often taking on debt to do so. However, after the war, the demand for grain sharply fell. This meant that farmers who had already invested in all of this equipment had to make some stark choices. They could either declare bankruptcy or they could try to sell more grain to make up the difference. Most people had no choice but to try to sell more grain. More grain coming onto the market further depressed the prices, and farmers were forced yet again to make that same choice, and so more and more land in turn was put under the plow. This caused a runaway ecological effect in the center part of North America, the Midwestern part of the United States and Canada. So that whole area of North America, it's sometimes referred to as the basket of North America. It's where tons of food was grown at that time and is still grown today. However, it is naturally a very arid part of the continent as well, and it goes through regular cycles of drought. Normally, the land is held in place, though, by large grasslands, and the grasslands keep the topsoil from blowing away. However, since so much of the land had been turned into agriculture, when drought came and the winds came, there was nothing to stop it from becoming a runaway effect, and this is what led to the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, a man-made ecological disaster. Here you see a farmer and his two sons during a dust storm in Oklahoma in 1936. The Dust Bowl essentially turned large parts of the Midwestern United States and Canada into a desert. Approximately 2 million people became homeless as farms and towns were abandoned throughout the Midwest. For the better part of a decade, images such as this would have been commonplace in the Midwestern United States and Canada. Here you see a massive dust storm rolling into town. These dust storms could be so bad that it was difficult to breathe. Children sometimes would be kept at school overnight because it wasn't safe for them to walk home. Here you see some children wearing goggles and homemade dust masks in the Midwest United States during the Dust Bowl. The dust was thick. It could cover homes. It could cover machinery. In many cases, whole towns and farms were completely abandoned. Hundreds of thousands of people from Oklahoma alone were forced to essentially flee the state. The term Okie came to be used almost as a derogatory term to refer to these migrants from Oklahoma and other states as they came to places like California looking for work. Thus, the Great Depression also marked a massive migration of people from state to state as they desperately tried to provide for their families. These are the photographs of the Migrant Mother, which came to symbolize the pain and suffering of the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl and of the plight of poor migrant farm workers in the United States. These photographs were taken by a government photographer named Dorothea Lange. And the photograph on the right in particular really was instrumental in leading to a massive shift in public opinion about the poverty of these people and a change in the government approach. They ended up providing way more support and changing the direction in many ways of the government response to the Great Depression. The photographs, though, have an interesting story in and of themselves. The woman who's depicted in this photograph, Florence Owens Thompson, was simply labeled anonymously as the migrant woman in Dorothea Lange's photograph. And Dorothea Lange describes her as a destitute pea picker who had just sold the tires from her car in order to provide food for her children. The real story apparently is much more interesting, and that it wasn't that at all. She was not a pea picker at all. And I encourage you to actually take a look at the video that I have in the recommended videos this week, which will tell you the whole story about the real person in this photograph, Florence Thompson, her family, and how these photographs came to symbolize the Great Depression. Generally speaking, the way world governments reacted to the Great Depression made it worse. They never encountered anything like this before. They acted according to a classical economic theory, and those theories basically intensified the crisis. Under classical economic theory, if tax revenue is falling, which of course it did during the Great Depression, then governments should in turn spend less. But as government activity decreases, so does the ability for people to get work and to pay taxes. And so it creates sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. This is what you would normally do on a personal level. Like if you lost your job, you would cut back. But in the Great Depression, governments cutting back spending turned out to be the worst possible thing that they could do. We also see a spike in interest rates everywhere. So nobody wants to lend anyone else any money because no one believes that they can pay it back. And so if they are going to lend money, then they're going to do it at a huge interest rate. So this essentially, again, diminishes economic activity and makes it worse. To top it all off, everybody, all the countries that is, started to be very protective over trade. They started to enact tariffs so that their local domestic industries would be protected. But that also meant that other people were enacting tariffs. So if Canada enacts a tariff, the United States enacts a tariff, and they end up not being able to sell to each other. Again, this diminishes economic activity. Now, there were some people that were calling for a new approach. One person is the British economist John Maynard Keynes. As it became known, the Keynesian alternative would be eventually the path that most governments would start to take. And generally speaking, this is now the way most governments react to recessions. And that is that government should spend money. Government should do the opposite of what they did during the Great Depression, that they should, in fact, in the absence of a functioning economy, if everyone else is afraid to spend, then the government has to. So the Keynesian approach can be seen in what the United States did beginning in 1933, which was called the New Deal. And this was a series of domestic programs, basically building roads and government buildings and infrastructure, where they just simply hired as many people as they possibly could, just put as many American men to work. Between 1933 and 1938. The idea is that the government will hire people if nobody else will, and then these people will take their earnings, and some of that money is going to go back into the economy because they're going to be buying things with it. Here's another image of men in Toronto protesting that their government helped them out. Canada enacted a similar program to the New Deal as well, and other countries followed suit. And there is some evidence to suggest that these initiatives did start to turn the page on the Great Depression. But the real event that moved us out of the Great Depression would be World War II. So we'll be talking about World War II in a moment, but first we're going to turn back to Russia and the Communist Revolution. So I'd like to turn back now to the Soviet Union. When we left off, we discussed how Stalin had come to power by killing all of his rivals after the death of Lenin in 1924. And once Stalin was in power by 1928, he had initiated the first of many five-year plans. In his five-year plans, Stalin envisioned the Soviet Union increasing its industrial output by massive amounts, and he was able to achieve this to a certain extent, but only at an incredibly high human cost. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, Stalin was also transforming agriculture in the Soviet Union. In many ways, Stalin's transformation of agriculture was far more dramatic than his transformation of industry. And nowhere was this felt more than in the Ukraine. The Ukraine had been part of the Soviet Union since 1922, and it was its main grain-producing region, such that sometimes Ukraine is referred to as the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. Beginning in 1928, however, all of the peasants and all the private farm holdings across the country were forced to be collectivized. That is, that they were forced to give up all of their holdings to the state, and then the state turned these into large state-run collective farms. Essentially, everyone became an employee of the state and gave up all their private possessions. Needless to say, not everybody approved of that, and there was quite a bit of resistance, but resistance was put down brutally by Stalin's government. Peasants were executed, exiled, or imprisoned frequently. Here you see an image of women on a collective farm in the early 1930s standing for the morning roll call. The idea behind collective farms was that the state could run these farms more efficiently and that there would be a surplus of food, and that surplus of food could be used to support the state in other ways. The brutality of this entire system reached its height in 1932 when essentially a famine that was almost entirely man-made swept across the Soviet Union. The famine is known in the Ukraine as the Holodomor, which means literally to starve to death. During the Holodomor, millions of Ukrainians starved to death, while Stalin exported their grain for money during the Great Depression to support the state. There's even stories of cannibalism and other horrors during this time period. During the 1930s, Stalin also made moves to solidify and make more permanent his control over the Soviet Union. And he did this by cracking down against any opposition, even within the communist government, to his rule. In 1934, a communist leader by the name of Sergei Kirov was murdered. He was found shot. There were rumors that Stalin had ordered the hit himself, although there's never been any direct evidence to suggest this. Nevertheless, Stalin used the murder as a pretense to launching a massive authoritarian crackdown across the country. He essentially used it to round up anyone who had any hint of political differences to him, including old Bolsheviks who had been his comrades during the initial communist revolution. He had show trials and numerous executions. Those that weren't executed were forced to be sent to Gulag work camps at the far reaches of the Soviet Union in Siberia. When all was said and done, perhaps as many as 6 million of his own citizens were killed during the Great Purge and Terror of the 1930s. Okay, so let's now turn from one genocidal maniac to another one. We're going to talk now about Hitler and the rise of the Nazi Party. Here you see Adolf Hitler speaking at the Lustgarten in Berlin in 1938. Hitler and the Nazis were modeled in many ways off of the fascist movement which had been developed by Benito Mussolini in Italy a decade earlier. And so we're going to see how fascism adapts from the Italian context to the German context, and with it changes in many different ways, particularly with its adoption of anti-Semitism and the Aryan myth as one of its central components. So the first thing I suppose you have to realize about Adolf Hitler is he wasn't born in Germany, at least not the nation of Germany. He was Austrian. He fought in the First World War and held the rank of a lance corporal. You can see him here in this image. He's over here on the far left. He obviously does not yet have his trademark mustache in the First World War, but in the First World War he was basically a regular soldier. I mean, he wasn't particularly distinguished for anything in particular. He did suffer blindness for a short period of time after a gas attack. But after the war, he joined a large disillusioned group of Germans who felt that the German leadership had let down the war effort and that the war effort had failed because of German leadership. So Hitler, when he begins his slow rise to power, emerges essentially as a rebel rouser, one of many in the political polarization of the Weimar Republic. So this is during that period in post-war Germany where we have a lot of political instability, many different groups vying for control. And one of those groups on the far, far right of the political spectrum was a small workers' socialist party, the Nazi Party. However, when Hitler joined with the Nazi Party, very slowly he began to transform it, and it really lost its socialism aspect and became much more of a fascist nationalist party over time. Hitler himself, as I said, was an Austrian-born person, but he was a staunch German-speaking nationalist. What I mean by that is he believed in pan-German nationalism, sort of the type of nationalism that existed prior to the creation of Germany. Really, the reason why we have a country of Germany and a country of Austria has more to do with the Austro-Hungarian Empire and its fact that it was resistant to the creation of Germany. Whereas there were many German nationalists that believed in a much larger German nation, a German Reich, if you will, that would bring together all German-speaking nations, and Hitler would certainly be a part of that group. He's also part of this large political force that's disillusioned by the state of post-war Germany. It's very easy to point fingers and say that the very fact that Germany was suffering the humiliating defeat was because of poor leadership. What makes Hitler's and the Nazis somewhat unique is that they really make anti-Semitism one of the pillars of that disillusionment. Frequently, Hitler will blame Jewish German leadership for the faults of the First World War. And he'll begin by sowing the seeds that all of Germany's problems really can be blamed on the Jewish population. In many ways, the Nazi Party and Hitler were both losers before they found each other. I mean, Hitler was a failed artist, a high school dropout. He hadn't really achieved much of note in the First World War. And after the war, he bounced around from job to job. The Nazi Party, on the other hand, didn't have any sort of charismatic leadership, and it failed to achieve very many of its political aims, and it was really a fringe party. Not noticed that much by the mainstream. However, Hitler and the Nazis together proved ultimately to be a fairly formidable force, and that's in no small part to Hitler's speaking skills. He was a very charismatic speaker, and he was able to get a lot of people, especially those who were disillusioned by the state of affairs in Germany in the 1920s, to buy into his anti-Semitic vision of German pride. Here you see Hitler posing with other of the leaders of the Nazi Party who were collectively arrested and put on trial for a failed coup d'etat which originated in a beer hall, the so-called beer hall push of 1923, where they tried to take over the local Bavarian government and failed spectacularly. Hitler was convicted of treason in the aftermath and was actually sentenced to 5 years in jail. However, he spent less than a year behind bars in the end, during which time he dictated his famous deranged autobiography, Mein Kampf. And Mein Kampf, of course, would become a blueprint for what Hitler would do in the decades to come. On the left here, you see an image of Hitler while he was in jail in 1924, and there is the cover of his Mein Kampf, his autobiography. Mein Kampf would become essentially a Bible of sorts to the Nazi Party, and it would outline many of Hitler's sort of core beliefs, such as identifying the Aryan, this sort of fictitious race of super Germans as being the master race, and that Jewish people were somehow less than human or even parasites. And these horrible, twisted, racist ideas, of course, would underlie many of the things that the Nazis and Hitler would do once they come into power a decade later in the early 1930s. In the late 1920s, the Nazi Party begins to really take on many of its characteristics as a fascist party, and Hitler begins to actively remodel it after Mussolini's version of fascism in Italy, which Hitler sees as an answer to how they can navigate through the political conditions in the Weimar Republic. So some of the characteristics would be its association with militarism. Just like Benito Mussolini began to sort of associate his party with the military, Hitler also does the same thing. Like in both places, there is an emphasis on national pride and a romanticized past. In both places, there's also a continual emphasis on traditional values, traditional Italian values, or in Germany, traditional German values. In addition, and this is where there's really the demarcation point between Mussolini and Hitler, in Hitler's version of fascism, there is the addition of anti-Semitism as well, and the position of some Germans being more German and others being not German at all, being the other. And that differentiation between the other and Hitler's Nazis would be the way that Hitler would rally support in the late 1920s. The Nazis, as we move into the 1930s, actually became a very popular party. They offered simple solutions to the complex problem that the Weimar Republic was facing. Because if you recall, the Weimar Republic struggled throughout the 1920s, but the 1930s were terrible for the Weimar Republic. It was in no position to deal with the Depression, which it had already been, dealing with rocky economic times throughout the entire 1920s, while the rest of the Western world had had relatively good times. So it was during that period that Hitler's simplistic solutions that he offered to people ended up winning over a sizable proportion of the German population. The Nazi Party's popularity increased to the point that by July of 1932, the Nazis had actually won the most number of seats in the government. With the Nazis now in control of the government, Hitler was appointed as Chancellor of Germany in 1933. Now, Hitler only needed one small crisis in order to have the cover to become a full dictator of Germany. But everything up to this point had been done democratically. Hitler and the Nazis had genuinely appealed to a sizable proportion of the German electorate and had actually been elected. And it's important to remember that, especially with the terrible things that come, that it was democracy that had actually let Hitler come to power in the first place. About a month after Hitler had become Chancellor, he managed to get the crisis that he was looking for. Mysteriously, the government buildings, the Reichstag building, caught on fire and burned to the ground. In the aftermath, Hitler and the Nazis claimed that a communist Jew had set it on fire, and that there were infiltrators all around the country, and that the country was teetering on the edge of collapse, unless the people did something about it. And then they did, to their detriment, as you'll see. Using the burning of the Reichstag as a call to arms, Hitler managed to get the government to pass the Enabling Act in March of 1933. This is it. This is what essentially made him a dictator. It gave him dictatorial powers. From this point onward, democracy doesn't really exist in Germany anymore, and it's just a bit of a farce. Hitler has complete control, and the Nazi Party has complete control. And it's at this point onward that we start to see Germany remodeled in the terrible vision of the Nazi Party. So what were the building blocks of Nazi policy in the 1930s? Well, first of all, everything was rooted in the concept of biological racism. That is, that humans are not all equal, and that certain races are better for one reason or another over other races, and in particular, in the German lens, anti-Semitism. That is, that Jewish people are less than human and are not proper Germans at all, which is obviously crazy because they had been Germans. For centuries, Jewish people had been living alongside other Germans, and they had fully integrated into the German nation, but now they found themselves scapegoated for all of Germany's problems. All of this also is rooted in their concept of social Darwinism. If you recall, social Darwinism is a warped reading of Darwin's theories of evolution. And in this case, it would be sort of taking the concept of survival of the fittest in nature and applying it to the human world and applying it to the political world. The idea that Germany and Germans had the natural right to exert power over the world for the sheer reason that they could, as if they were operating by the natural rules of nature. And Hitler and the Nazis, to them, all of the problems of Germany were due to the fact that they had been keeping themselves in check, that they hadn't actually been exerting this natural power, and that Jews were the source of all of Germany's problems. And so they launched horrible propaganda campaigns to support that position, to bring as much of the population on side to that way of thinking. So, for example, you see like a poster here, Der Jude. These type of horrible posters were commonplace once the Nazis took power. The virulent hatred that the Nazis were spreading around the nation towards Jewish people, not surprisingly, began to erupt in real acts of violence. So probably the most blatant example is Kristallnacht, which was a series of coordinated attacks against Jews throughout Nazi Germany and parts of Austria on the November 9th and 10th in 1938. This was where Jewish shops and houses were smashed or burned, and Jews, if they were seen on the street, were beaten. This is really the beginning of the reality that Jewish people were going to have to leave Germany if they were going to have any hope of a normal life whatsoever at all, and began a period of encouraging an exodus out of the country. So while Hitler was pursuing radically racist anti-Semitic policies at home in the mid-1930s, outwardly the rest of the world was often presenting Hitler and the Nazis as a bit of a success story. At the height of the Great Depression, Hitler had seemingly turned the German economy around. He'd done this largely by ignoring much of the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles, such as reparation payments, which he simply stopped making, and the world largely looked on. That's in part because it was generally thought that the Treaty of Versailles had been unfair and that it was probably right for Germany to ignore aspects of it. Time magazine made Hitler its Man of the Year several times during the 1930s, in particular in 1938, when Hitler was secretly already preparing for war. Incidentally, Joseph Stalin was also made Times Man of the Year in the 1930s, so take that with a grain of salt. The 1936 Berlin Olympics were a chance for Hitler and the Nazis to showcase what Germany had become, and the entirety of the Olympics were essentially presented as a huge propaganda piece for the entire world. However, the reality was, by the late 1930s, Hitler was already making plans for war. For Hitler, the inevitability of war is rooted in the social Darwinist concept that Germany, if it's powerful and mighty, has every right to exert that power and might in the world. Central to Nazi ideology was a concept of Lebensraum, the idea that Germans deserved and needed more living space, meaning they needed more land. And this became a central justification for the ultimate expansion of the Nazis in Germany into Eastern Europe. So next week we will see how Hitler puts his concept of Lebensraum into practice, and then we'll see how the rest of the world reacts. That's right, next week in our final lecture podcast for modern Europe, World War II, and what happens immediately after World War II. See you then.